One of the fascinating things about your impending election, if I'm not getting ahead of myself, is that you were a student at Columbia. You were very, very deeply involved in Columbia and New York City's response to the protests that you were involved in. And now you are going to be the member of Congress that is going to be representing Columbia University. So I'm very curious in what ways you plan to try to use your position to impact Columbia and how it deals with protest and speech on the question of Israel and Palestine.
I think one of the things that this community has been really vocalizing that it wants to see from the university is it wants access to the things that it has a right to, right? The gates at Columbia have been closed, and that is a public street that people in this community have been denied access to for well over a year now. And that's one of the fights that I'm going to be working with the various levels of government to take on. I'm going to be making sure that, we're not having our community be used as ground zero for Trump's fascist takeover, right? And I think what we have seen is the Trump administration, use this community as its, experimentation for its fascist policies. It did that with Colombia, it did that with student protesters, it did that with my friend Mahmoud. Like it's time that we have representation that's going to show up for the community here, who's now facing, who's facing ICE raids at unprecedented levels, right? Who's facing a crisis in terms of our higher education where more and more of our students are being priced out of it, right? And be that at Columbia or at the public institutions here that don't have the funding to adequately resource their professors, their programs, right? At institutions like CUNY, for example, where more and more students are being forced to leave the programs altogether because they can't afford to stay. And I think it's time that we have representation that is willing to take on that fight.
And what levers of influence do you think you would have as a member of Congress I mean, obviously, Colombia has become quite repressive in the way it deals with protest. What levers would be at your disposal to impact that?
There's a number of things that we can be doing, including using the bully pulpit of the office, right? Making sure that we are actually pushing a narrative that is centering the right of speech and academic freedom, right? For not just students, but for professors as well. Making sure that we're protecting it and making sure that we are reminding folks what an institution like Columbia is supposed to be, which is a place of learning and higher education and research, right? And not a place of protecting landlords, right? Is what Columbia has in many ways become. It's pushing a lot of our community out, right, through its land ownership, right? Just buying up more and more properties and displacing so much of the community here in Harlem and in Washington Heights with this medical center. The other thing we can do is, working with all levels of government to make sure that we're holding it accountable when it is violating, right, the rights of the surrounding community, including with the fact that it is blocking off public access to a public street. Making sure that we are holding it accountable in all these violations, making sure that it's also paying its taxes, its fair share in taxes, so we can fund institutions like CUNY, right? And so there are a number of things that we can be doing in a legislative sense, but also in using the office, right, to bring attention to the way it's interacting with the surrounding community.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your relationship with Mahmoud Khalil and what you learned from him, and also what how concerned you are that ultimately his fight to stay in the United States that may be lost.
I try to focus on where the paths towards winning are, right? And I think like he's someone who remains very hopeful in really difficult times. And I I think that's something that he and I actually have in common is that I try to make sure that where there's still a path, that we keep our eyes on that path. And so, he's a friend, and I'm so grateful to call him a friend. He's been really supportive actually through this whole campaign in as a friend, right? Um, and I really, when I was deciding whether or not I wanted to run, because I was recruited, one of the questions that kept coming back to my mind was, what would it have meant to Mahmoud and Noor to have somebody who was actually responsive to what they were going through, right? And I think about the millions of people across the country who are now fearful that their spouse might be next, right? And I can't help but wonder what context would we be in today, right? If we had had people at every single level of government fighting back against the Trump administration and the fact that he used my friend as the blueprint for how he would engage with immigration enforcement going forward, right? And I think something that gets lost often in this question of Palestine is the way that this crackdown on Palestinian activists has impacted almost every single fight that we are seeing today, whether that's on immigration, whether that's on healthcare or whatever, pick your issue, because at the core of it, right, is this question of, do you believe that all people have a right to human dignity, right? And if you are willing to fight against a genocide, right, then you're someone who can also be trusted to fight for things that are life-sustaining, right? And I see Medicare for all as a life-sustaining fight, right? I see housing for all as a life-sustaining fight, and making sure that we are centering a politic of life in everything that we do.
I'm struck that you've spoken in very universal terms about a politics of human dignity and a politics of human equality. It seems to me part of what we face in this moment is a politics on another side of the political spectrum, which emphasizes the centrality of nationhood, citizenship, and borders, and says actually our obligations are to those people who are citizens of our country, not to other people who are human beings, but that there's a very nationalistic framework. And I'm curious, obviously, we do live in a world of nations. And so I'm curious, do you think that Americans should think of ourselves as having the same moral obligations to people who are not Americans as to people who are Americans? And how do you balance this question of citizenship and nationhood versus universal moral obligation?
I think we do have a universal moral obligation because at the end of the day, right, when you look around, right, not everyone in this country is a citizen. But the fight that they're facing is one that impacts you, right? And in this community where it is a heavily immigrant community, we see the impact of that every single day, right? Where you have ICE raids that have made it so that the absentee rates in this district are some of the highest in the city for schools, for school children, because families are terrified of being separated, right? And they don't send their children because they don't want to be separated from them. The poverty rate is growing, and it coincides with a moment where people are afraid to go to work because they don't want to be separated from their families. All of this has an impact on every single person in our community, right? And we've seen the way that ICE has killed so many people, including American citizens, right? Detained American citizens. The moment that we start to make exceptions for which humans we're willing to fight for and which we're not. That is when we've started saying that it is okay for these systems to come after us as well. Because inevitably that's the consequence, right? The circle of acceptable people to let down in this way grows every single iteration, right? And I think it's imperative that we really start to see one another, right, as human beings first.